So, it's March, and in a few short weeks, gaming history will be made. A new Half-Life game's coming out, and not an off-brand crowd-funded disaster, a real Half-Life game. But seeing as it's a VR exclusive, I imagine this might finally coax the last few people who haven't hopped onto the VR bandwagon into taking the plunge into a VR system. But trust me when I say, if this is your first time playing VR, you do not want to jump into a multi-hour immersive campaign as your first experience. Virtual reality can be a very scary place with lots of confusing and disoriented things going on, so whether you've got a Vive, Oculus, Index, or maybe you just want a refresher, here are 6 VR games that'll get your brain prepped for the full-speed hype train that is Half-Life Alyx. If you want to ride a motorcycle, you start on a bike. Simply put, this is like dipping your toes into the water before diving straight into the pool. The lab is a free proving grounds of sorts that Valve put out specifically to help people come to terms with the mechanics and interactions you'll be experiencing in a VR space. For beginners, I would consider this to be an absolute must, as not only will it get you acclimated to your headset and controllers in a low-stress environment, there are actually some pretty fun games here too. A tower defense thing, an Angry Birds clone, and some nice visual set pieces that really flex off how immersive virtual reality can be. If you've already tried VR before, you can probably get away with skipping this one, but considering it packs in more content in a more polished package than most $20 VR games that come off feeling more like tech demos, you really can't go wrong with giving this one a shot. Plus, if you ever invite somebody over to try out VR, this is actually the perfect game to load them into. It's a very non-threatening, comical environment. I'd say it's the perfect game to load into so they don't instantly sprint into a TV or punch a hole in your wall. Now, like I said, a lot of these VR games on Steam come off feeling like tech demos. A necessary step to show off the tech before more complicated experiences can be crafted around the technology. But raw data feels like a full package. Gameplay-wise, it's pretty simple, most of the maps being wave survival or tower defense type of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's a full-on bona fide game. There's a story, there's multiple characters to unlock and level up, an online scene that, while it's pretty dead, was fun when it came out. It still has co-op that you can play with friends throughout the story missions, and that's a lot of fun. But past all that, it really is just a lot of fun to play. It really reminds me of one of those old school arcade light gun shooters like Time Crisis. It starts off pretty simple with just a few low-level enemies and a single pistol, but slowly you ramp up until you're picking off hordes of enemies with a bow using 4 types of arrows, lobbing out 5 at a time like Legolas. None of the controls are really too complicated, and it's more just point and shoot, with the reloads being automatic most of the time. So I think it's the perfect game to play to get comfortable with the twitch reactions and quick thinking that a VR game requires. Because if you thought you choked up in FPS games before, just wait till you have to reload with 2 enemies literally inches away from your face. Being comfortable with quick reactions in VR is super important, because while reloading in a regular game is just pressing X, you have to physically do an action to get back into the game in VR. And this is great to get into the custom of that. The missions are broken up into these 15 to 20 minute bursts, so it never really feels overwhelming. And it can also make a really fun party game just to slap somebody into and laugh while they flail their arms around pretending to have 2 katanas until they punch a hole in your wall. Playing Superhot in VR really makes you wonder why they would even bother to make it in not VR. This game lends itself so effortlessly to the medium of virtual reality. You would think the minimalist graphics and polygonal enemies would break your immersion, but it really doesn't, and I think it's one of the more immersive games, honestly. Opting for a more simplistic, stylistic approach is way less distracting than subpar textures popping in and out of you in a super realistic game. From the second I booted it up till I took my headset off, I had the dumbest smile on my face as I twisted and bended around the room like Neo from the Matrix. I mean, that's what it felt like I was doing. I probably looked out some strung out bogan in front of a 7-Eleven, but that's just something you need to expect when you're playing VR. You look lame as hell, but you feel so friggin' cool. And that's where Superhot kind of excels to me. Getting out of your comfort zone and really accepting the fact that laying down on the floor and holding both of your arms out in a T-pose is a viable strategy. When you first start playing around in VR, you're really stiff just holding out your arms and turning your head to see where you are, but it actually makes you better at the game if you're very fluid in your movements, ducking and diving and getting out of the way of things, not just moving your control stick, but actually interacting in the physical space. More than once in Superhot, I found myself on my back with a gun in each hand only to get shot and have the overwhelming embarrassment of my current situation set in as I reloaded to give it another go. But the game never lets you really dwell on that. Hop back in, throw a bottle at a guy, grab his gun, shoot him with his own gun, spin, shoot his friend, grab his gun, shoot his gun at another guy, throw the gun at somebody else, all in slow motion, and oh my god, it just feels so cool. When you die, it sends you back to the beginning of the level, and that can be kind of frustrating to lose an entire level of progress to one stray bullet that you didn't think really hit you, but it really does help you streamline your movements and your strategies until your final successful run is the most coolest, badass way to beat that level possible. Winning in this game isn't about just reaching the end of the level, it's about feeling like John Wick as you do it. It's all really fun until you end up trying to Mike Tyson a dude and end up punching a hole in your wall. You know, maybe try and do all of this in a more open space if you can. By far, one of the most challenging hurdles to overcome in virtual reality is the movement. Developers have been dealing with this issue for a while, cutting down motion sickness by adding a blur to your vision as you're walking, or a Dishonored type of teleportation system, instead of just walking around, because honestly, moving in VR while your legs are stationary is a really weird feeling. I think it has something to do with your inner ear not feeling the inertia on it when you start and stop while your eyes are telling your brain that something should be happening, but the point is, if you get motion sickness from VR and want a space shuttle centrifuge of the game to break you out of it, Jed Island is the way to go. By far, one of the most intense and interesting experiences I've ever had in VR was booting up this game, hopping in, jumping on a levitating surfboard, rocketing down a hill with these wrist-mounted rockets, and promptly screaming like a child as I saw a wall approaching me at 135 miles an hour. The ensuing terror and tension that your body does while you prepare for an impact that's most certainly going to kill you is only beaten out by the feeling of when you actually hit the wall and realize, oh yeah, this is just a game. I'm safe. Honestly, I think this game helped me beat my motion sickness issues just by making me too scared to even look at the edges of my vision. The whole time you're super hyper focused on the next obstacle in front of you as you rocket and swing and slide your way up the map. Gameplay wise, it reminds me of Shadow of the Colossus, with some of these smaller objectives to unlock abilities and these really massive boss fights.
Oh, this is the tongue, and the whole thing is the worm.
There's no story or set path on how you're supposed to play. You're just set out to explore and zip around. And if you have a really bad motion sickness issue, I can't promise that this will make it better. I mean, hell, it might make it worse for you, but I basically had to stop playing Fallout 4 VR because I could only do it for about a half an hour at a time. But a few hours in this game really got me used to the whole movement systems in VR. Taking massive cliff falls or spinning around a tower at 250 miles an hour was a great therapy session for me. And again, more than all that, it's also a really fun game with a very low chance of punching a hole in your wall, so give it a shot. By far one of the best VR games I've ever played, or any $20 game in general for that matter, is Hotdogs, Horseshoes, and Hand Grenades. Honestly, I feel sort of guilty having to supplement that by saying VR game, like it's some sort of badge the game has to wear to keep in its own section, but it really is just fantastic on its own merits. I've been following this game a little bit since after its launch, and what started out as a tiny shooting range with 2 guns and a grenade has flourished into a full experience with over 300 unique firearms. Each one painstakingly modeled and coded to work exactly like their real-life counterparts. Over the past few years, the game went through 80-something updates, each one of them having their own alphas and testing branches. New game modes, physics integrations, so much being piled into this $20 experience when they could have just taken the money and ran. Go check out Anton Hand on YouTube and just buy the game to support his work, because honestly it's one of the coolest things in the world to see an indie dev put so much love into supporting a game, while AAA devs dump half-finished products onto our laps and then run away when they don't feel like fixing it. And at the end of the day, this is by far the best firearm simulator on the market today. The interactions with some of these guns actually have a pretty steep learning curve just from how realistic it all is. Remember when I said reloading in VR isn't just pressing X, you actually have to make the gun reload. You have to take out the magazine, grab another one, put it in the mag well, rack the slide, flip off the safety, and then aim and fire. If you have something like an LMG or musket, you have to go through 8 or 9 actions before you can fire, versus any other game where you just press X and wait 5 seconds. It might come off sounding tedious, but honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of VR so far. Having to focus on your hands while you toss in a new magazine and slam the bolt release, all while an enemy hot dog is squishing and squashing their way towards you. It's hectic and intense, and every mistake you make is another second that an enemy has the chance to flank you. All leading up to you pulling out your sidearm, aiming it up, pulling the trigger, and hearing that deafening click as the hammer falls on an empty chamber because you forgot to load a round. But that's not the end of the world, because the physics are so fucking cool that you can rack back the slide on the edge of a table or corner of a wall. And if that's not the coolest shit in the world to you, you can just get out of here right now. I actually don't want to talk about this too in depth because I want to do a full video on it at some point in the future, but if you're looking for a fun time and the premier way to train yourself on weapon handling in VR, look no further. I can't imagine Half-Life Alyx is going to have weapon interactions this complex, but it should definitely help you get better at reloading. So even with a VR Half-Life game coming out, I still want to call Boneworks Half-Life's VR spiritual successor. Why, I can't really put my finger on. It's something about the moment-to-moment explorations, the familiar world mixed with just enough strange to keep it bizarre, the deep physics system with physics-based puzzles and platforming, the ammo boxes that are suspiciously similar, or the head, what would you call those, spiders? This is the first VR game I've ever played that really feels like a worthy single-player campaign experience. From start to finish, it has such great level design, atmosphere, the exploration, the weapon handling. I mean, it sounds weird, but this felt like a game. Something that if it was just on a flat screen would still be a fun experience, but having it in VR improves it in every way, shape, and form. Skyrim and Fallout were both fun VR games, but nothing about them really ever felt like they needed to be in VR. Putting them in VR was literally just an afterthought, whereas Boneworks was built from the ground up to be a great linear first-person shooter in a VR space. It's hard to put into words just how important I think this game is to the medium. Like, imagine being in the 1980s. Sure, you had Pac-Man and Pong, and plenty of awesome arcade games that are still a blast to play and classics to this day. But then Zelda comes out. There's a story, there's save points, there's a point to the game, linear progressions with objectives, goals, a sense of purpose. It was more than just see how high you can get your score. It was a full-on game. And I know that's probably not the first or only example of it, I'm just saying. That's really what Boneworks felt like to me. This was an incredibly ambitious project that could have failed miserably if it was executed poorly. And while the physics are so ambitious that it does feel like a little too much from time to time, they put out a great game here. And for half the price of what it should be, it's a must play. It has slow-mo that you can trigger at any time with no meter or cooldown whatsoever. And while that nerfs the difficulty in some cases, I'm so glad they left it in, because slow motion in virtual reality really is the coolest thing ever. Nothing is more satisfying than reaching out to grab a dummy's head before pulling out a Glock, pressing it to its head, and watching the shell slowly tumble away through the air as you pull the trigger. But like Half-Life Alyx, this should by no means be your first VR game ever, or even your second for that matter. There's a lot this game expects you to have a handle on when you hop in, and for a brand new player, I think this would just be an overwhelming experience. But if you feel like you're up to the task, I think Boneworks can stand alone as its own game, not just something to play while you wait for Half-Life Alyx, but it will also help you wait for Half-Life Alyx. So that's my list, 6 games that should help you get acclimated for the first Half-Life game in 13 years. This is by no means a definitive list of games that you have to play in VR, I just think that these 6 specific experiences will help you transition into Half-Life Alyx a lot easier. There are definitely plenty of other great games out there to check out, so if this is your first time getting into VR, get exploring. Be sure to check your Steam library for any games you might have that are already VR compatible. Tabletop Simulator, Project Cars 2, Payday 2, all of them support VR in the base game, so you don't even have to pay for the VR versions, and you can even play with people not in VR. So if you liked the video and managed to make it to the end, why don't you drop a comment down about what game you think people should play in VR to get ready for Half-Life Alyx, or just a VR game you want people to play in general. Also, because the algorithm focuses super heavy on video engagement, I promise you'll hear back from me. This video was actually pretty fun to make, and it got me in my VR headset for the first time in a few months, so if there's any VR game you want to see covered or more in-depth review on, let me know. Or if you want a regular game covered in more in-depth, let me know. Or you just want to see something, you know, let me know. Leave a comment or something. I just really want to quit my job and do this full time because this is the most creative thing I've done in like a year now. So any sort of help for ideas is wonderful because I'm drowning for content right now. Anyways, thanks for watching.